Welcome to our July series with Red May on Marxism and the capitalist state towards a new debate. I'm here today with Nate Holdren and Jasmine Chorley-Schulz. Uh, Very excited for this. We have been working on this thing for a little while. Had a little bit of a health intervention for a minute and was a bit of a toss-up, and now we're back at it. Very excited. Um, I remember when this book came out last year. I was pumped and excited to read it. Hadn't had my hands on it yet, and watched a great talk from many of the authors and editor authors as well with the Marxist Education Project, and was watching it at my warehouse where I work with my coworkers. You'd think, oh, this is dull. Why is this guy doing this to us? Why are we listening to lectures? And walked away from that. We all went to the bar afterwards, had this long conversation. Everybody was really interested and fascinated by the topics they were hearing, and felt like a new vantage and approach to thinking about communism and socialism and Marxist analysis. So I can say the proof is in the pudding for the book for me. If you are interested in checking the book out, there are a number of ways to procure it, including buying it, as well as other things. But if you're not sure and you want to maybe take a tiptoe in, feel it out, over at Marx and Philosophy Review of Books, Tony Smith has an amazing review of the book. Just in-depth, excellent grasp of all of the thought and concepts therein. As Nate said before the event started, in this back room we have over here, if you read that review, you'll know whether you love it or you hate it before you start it. Before we introduce our panelists today, I also just really want to give a shout out to the editors of this collection, Rob Hunter, Raphael Kachachurian, and Eva Nanopoulos. It is such a great collection of work that they arduously put together, and have done their part in connecting people around the world with this text. They also wrote, maybe hands down, one of the best, clearest, and most thoughtful introductions to a book that I've seen in a while. So check the introduction, read their thought, read their analysis, get caught up in the space that we are working in contemporary Marxism today. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists. They're each going to talk for 15 to 20 minutes. Then we'll have a little bit of discussion amongst ourselves, and then open it up for questions. Make sure to put your questions in through YouTube, or send them to us via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, email, send me a postcard, whatever. We'll take care of it. Okay, so introducing first Jasmine. Jasmine Chorley-Schulz is a political science PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Her dissertation is on class, state, and social formation in military and security relations. Jasmine is an editor for Legal Form. Also, if you haven't checked out Legal Form, please read, become a dedicated reader to Legal Form. We're also here with Nate Holdren. Nate is a legal historian of labor, disability, and employment relations at Drake University. His writing appears at Organizing Work, Legal Form, Bill of Health, Time, and the Legal History blog. His first book, which I cannot recommend enough, is Injury Impoverished: Workplace Accidents, Capitalism, and Law in the Progressive Era. We're going to start with Jasmine and then work our way over to Nate.
All right. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here at Red May for the first time as a speaker, not the first time as an audience member. So thank you to our wonderful organizers. As we said, the book we're here to talk about today is called Marxism and the Capitalist State. And I also want to thank our amazing editors, Rob, Raphael, and Ava. My contribution is called Soldiers and the State in Marx and Engels. And this chapter offers an interpretation of Marx and Engels' own writing on soldiers, which is a under-examined aspect of their thought on the state and generally. So it's going to be a bit of a history of political thought style talk. Maybe I should have had slides, so there'll be a lot of quotations, but if you're interested in seeing the quotations up close and personal with footnotes, they're all in the chapter. So I'll do my best to bring you all along as I'm talking. Okay, so why the soldiers? Why the state? What our governments do internationally is to generalize the part of political life that we seem to have the least democratic control over. It seems that the best we can usually hope for is to express our convictions loudly enough that politicians may choose to opt for certain phrasing over others. But like other areas of social life where we feel alienated and powerless, healthcare, education, housing, the ruling class are not the ones who make all these things possible. The rest of us are, right, through our work. This is the core of alienation. Our labor is what powers the world, but we have very little democratic power over how that's done, how it's planned, to what ends our labor is put, political decisions. And as I hope is clear, by calling something work or labor, I am not saying that it is morally good. Marx wanted to abolish wage labor, after all, not applaud it. So maintaining and using military institutions requires people to carry out work, and all kinds of work, right? This is ultimately what my chapter makes a case for: attention to the labor that comprises the state. And in particular, I'm looking at kind of the most exceptional form of labor, right? The labor of legitimate use of force, violence, killing, hurting other people. But there's so much more work that goes into the military, right? And there's a lot of really interesting historical work on this, from construction to the sex work that occurs always around military bases. There's such a wide range of work that goes into it, and this is just one specific form of work that I'm studying. And I want to focus on one particular section of my chapter today, where I discuss the cooperative character of both industrial production and industrial militarism to compare two important sites of social life where the cooperative power of labor, whether as soldiers or as workers, appears in the fetish form of a power of capital or of the capitalist state. Fetish is like one of these can be jargony Marxist words, but I think it's pretty straightforward. The state does have objective power that we can see, but kind of what makes up that power is kind of obscured at the same time. So there's always kind of these two dimensions going on, right? If you've read Marx's Capital, there's this kind of amazing power of capital that is, unique to the capitalist moment. And then he peels back all the layers and you see that there's actually all this surplus labor going on under the surface. So that's kind of the comparison I want to draw out today. So in many ways, the military is a lot like other state institutions. It's historical, right? It's not some kind of ideal form that drops from the sky and always looks the same way in all places and times. It's embedded in historical dynamics. It emerges from class society, meaning a society that has class divisions, and it shares the underlying social relations of the rest of the society it's embedded in. So in our case, capitalist society. Its basis in class division and direction from the ruling class mean that it is necessarily an undemocratic form of politics. And while it is dependent on economic production, military force is in and of itself unproductive of capital. It does not extract surplus value from soldiers the way, like workers in the proverbial kind of factory setting. And the state and the military can only spend and consume state revenues. So the revenues that are presupposed by armed forces expenditure require production in the general economy, right? We know, I'm not an American, but we all know the size of the military budget is famously huge in this country. And that requires production in the general economy, right? Even if it's borrowed or financed in kind of more modern ways. So although the state does not extract surplus values from soldiers, like the kind of proverbial factory worker, there's a striking commonality between the concrete activity of capitalist production and of state coercive force, which is cooperation. So in Capital, Marx defines cooperation in production in the proverbial factory as the state of affairs when numerous workers work together side by side in accordance with a plan, whether in the same process or in different but connected processes. And this form of labor is called cooperation. Cooperation is a qualitative change in production that arises from a quantitative change. Marx cites the example of, there's 100 men who could easily together lift a ton of weight, whereas one man cannot. 10 men would strain to do so. While the capitalist may pay for each worker's labor power of those, hypothetical 100 men, he does not pay for this feature of combined labor power, right? This qualitative change that occurs from the combination of all these people working together. The capitalist gets this extra power at no cost, and it appears as if it is inherent to capital because it occurs in the capitalist setting. Marx says that the fundamental form of the capitalist mode of production is cooperation. So Marx uses the commonality between capitalist production and military force to great rhetorical effect throughout Capital, as you may have noticed if you read the book before. So he compares them to demonstrate two crucial qualities. So firstly, this cooperative power of output, like what you can produce through cooperation. And also, on the other hand, the discipline, authority, and command over that cooperative power. So, for example, here's one of these kind of industrial military comparisons he uses. Just as the offensive power of a squadron or cavalry, or the defensive power of an infantry regiment, is essentially different from the sum of the offensive or defensive powers of the individual soldiers taken separately, so the sum total of the mechanical forces exerted by isolated workers differs from the social force that is developed when many hands cooperate in the same undivided operation, such as raising a heavy weight, turning a winch, or getting an obstacle out of the way. I'm sure like many of us can think of examples where we have experienced this kind of thing, where you feel quite powerless as an individual person, and then you're working together with many, many other people, and all of a sudden you can achieve something that you never thought would be imaginable as an individual. So in the course of valorizing capital, the cooperative labor process also generates incredible revolutionary power. Thus, for the capitalists, their command over the power of that productive mass is incredibly important. Cooperation develops revolutionary potential as the labor, quote unquote, strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capabilities of his species. But it does so initially for the purpose of capitalist accumulation. So the task of controlling this power is again an opportunity for Marx to draw a military comparison. He says that a capitalist should command in the field of production is now as indispensable as that a general should command on the field of battle. He elaborates on the various roles subordinate to command, right? He says an industrial army of workers under the command of a capitalist requires, like a real army, officers comparable to managers, NCOs comparable to your foremen, your overseers, who command during the labor process in the name of capital. So we see this kind of comparison of a chain of command. The military metaphors call to mind this tremendous power of a cooperative mass of people and a capitalist impetus to control that power. He says, as the number of cooperating workers increases, so too does the resistance to the domination of capital and necessarily the pressure put on by capital to overcome this resistance. So as with the military leader and his troops, alienation here has to be maintained by the capitalist. Hence, the interaction between their various labors confronts them in the realm of ideas, as a plan drawn up by the capitalist and in practice as his authority, as the powerful will of a being outside them who subjects their activity to his purpose. All this immense cooperative power of labor appears as a power inherent in capital. And in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels also use this comparison. They compare the domination in industrial production to the military. They say, quote, modern industry has converted the little workshop or patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into a factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. And while rhetorically powerful, comparing the cooperative power of labor to military force also reveals the character of these things in a way that is more than just metaphor, I think. So the modern military, just like the capitalist mode of production, requires a mass of people working cooperatively. These masses are alienated from the means of production, do not themselves decide to what use they will be put, and are brought together to labor for a single entity, the state, under the delegated supervision and command of an external entity, officers, including promoted fellow workers, like non-commissioned officers. So only when they're brought together in this advanced form can they produce a qualitatively new force that is not only more powerful, but also intrinsically collective, Marx calls it. The concrete commonality between the productive industrial workplace and the consuming state military is the force of the organized cooperative labor of a mass of people subjected to the ends of a boss or a king or a president, in the case of this country. In production, workers' cooperative power is developed for the sake of its productive power, that is, for the valorization of capital. So, like the productive power of workers threatening the command of capital, right, like a strike, or any kind of organization, or trying to break with that alienation in some way, the mass of soldiers also presents a threat to the military and its state command. Furthermore, in both cases, competition and conflict between capitals or between national bourgeoisies, between states, enlist working people into alignment against one another for the economic or political objectives of their ruling class. Right, the classic kind of vision and critiques there of World War I, where you had like the masses of the working classes of Germany and France and Russia all lined up to kill each other for their kings, and the ruling classes using them as cannon fodder, right? That classic imagery of cannon fodder. But it's very similar also, right? And we see this mostly in the language of xenophobia, right? Often in terms of pitting workers against other workers who look different or come from a different place, right? It's this classic lining up of workers against one another for the sake of their bosses or ruling class. So both labor processes embody the power of the mass of expropriated classes, those who produce the economic and state power of their own domination, but contain the potential power to overcome it. The force generated by the mass organized force of military labor occurs regardless of its unproductivity of any exchange value. So the setting of the army, lacking the direct compulsion of value extraction, shows how it is the labor that produces such great concrete force. Further, the hierarchy of military command, like kind of capital command, produces the illusion of its own necessity. The cooperative heights of their domination contain the revelation of their power, right? Your boss is really powerful because you've made it so, right? Through your work, you've created their power. And the productive economic power on the one side of this comparison between industry and military structurally underwrites the military power of the other, right? So when we're building up capital in the countries where we live, we're building up state revenues, we're building up state force. We're all implicated in this web. And in capitalist society, the force of productive power and of state power are similar in really fundamental ways. So they're generally characterized by the cooperative and organized mass of power of the expropriated classes for the enrichment or battles of the ruling classes. And there's another way to read this, right? From a liberal perspective. The one produces economic activity and the other state authority, two sides of a well-functioning society providing the goods of prosperity and safety, you know? We're all Adam Smith. But by acknowledging the antagonism of class societies, we see and accept that productive economic power is not neutral, but historical and exploitative, and the state itself is the political form of capitalist social relations. So what of the soldiers themselves, right? The masses of state power. Is it sufficient to see military power and their masses as antagonistic to the masses of labor? Or is it a similarly exploitative enterprise? Well, the soldier is a formal role, right? Like if you go to work as a barista, let's say, from my own personal experience, that's not all of who I am. That is a role. That's who I'm paid to be for a set amount of time. But soldiers are drawn from capitalist society, right? We don't have like a separate class system or people outside of the class system in capitalist society. And over the course of the 19th century, when Marx and Engels are writing, these masses that are brought into these roles as soldier were none other than the expropriated classes, right? Productive and unproductive workers alike, right? Proletarians and surplus laborers. And like the industrial workers, soldiers embodied the power of the mass of the expropriated classes, where the site of their domination contained its opposite, the power, skills, and abilities to rule for themselves. And in conducting analysis at any given historical moment, the formal ideal role of soldiers should be considered in relation to broader economic and political dynamics, I argue. So classes are not stagnant, as we should know, particularly as political subjects. Class reconstitution, variation, transformation, emergence, and disappearance. This is a feature of capitalism. Soldiers have historically been drawn from feudal relations, from peasants, and from proletarians, and have variously taken different sides in class struggle. And we should attend to changes in their broader context as we seek to understand those historic and contemporary struggles and the diverse roles soldiers have played. On the right, on the left, reactionary, revolutionary, they're all over the place. Militaries, like states, are not outside history. State force in the capitalist state contains both relics of earlier social forms and uniquely capitalist characteristics. General economic production makes possible production for arms, infrastructure, and other assets which make state force possible. Likewise, the labor power required to put those assets into action is drawn from social classes subject to the social forces of capitalism. So the state does not extract surplus value from soldiers in its employ, but the labor power necessary for both mass militaries and capitalist production share cooperative quality and a kind of class origin. The distinctiveness of capitalism lies in the fact that the masses of people are exploited and alienated from the means of production, and with them are brought together not in a self-directed, active, collective practice, or to fulfill feudal obligations, for example, but in order to produce for a single entity under an external command. So when workers are brought together in this form, they can produce a qualitatively new, destructive or productive force that is not only more powerful, but also intrinsically collective. And a particular military is shaped by the particular historical development of economic forces and associated class struggles. And military practices, including matters of organization, bureaucracy, military science, are influenced by technological development, but also crucially by capitalist social relations, which I would say also influence technological development. Highlighting the processes of class struggle in which people move between the masses, the army, the masses, by situating both the institutions and the service members in their employ in the broader context of class struggle, opens up, I believe, a productive Marxist approach to understanding war in capitalist society. And I think beyond war, I think kind of all state institutions potentially. The class struggle shapes military institutions in class societies, and politically, we should be interested in these institutions not just when they're deployed and what they're doing, but of course we should be concerned about those things, but also how they're reproduced and who's reproducing them. In these two important sites of social life, the cooperative power of labor, of the working class, of proletarians, peasants, or surplus populations, whatever the case may be in a given place and time, this cooperative power appears in the fetish form of a power of capital or power of the capitalist state. Just as we turn our critical eye to bosses who say that their genius or their capital produces goods that we know that we produce, we should be critical of the power of the state too. Working people produce the power of capital and the power of the state, and we can critique how that power should be used or question whether people should devote their lives to perpetuating its existence and the consumption of nature's resources to that end. And I think the work that happens inside the world's militaries not only tells us a great deal about the state, but also labor in general. And I'll wrap up here and happy to take any questions or clarify things that I spoke too fast over in the Q&A. So thank you all.
Jasmine, that was great. Thank you so much for that. I'm curious, how did you become interested in the military in this context? Like what kind of compelled your question and interest?
I kind of was always interested in international politics, and then I think I was kind of a latecomer to left-wing politics, but as I started to become interested in like trade unionism yeah, I started to think more and more when I was reading about current events or studying international politics in university, like, well, who's doing this? Isn't that it? Like, I found that interesting. I in undergrad I studied especially the British Empire. I'm from Canada, and I always found it really interesting to study kind of Scotland and Ireland and the kind of proto colonies in the United Kingdom, which were experienced this kind of a lot of like kind of early versions of what would then kind of be spread out over the world by oftentimes Irish and Scottish people as soldiers and as settlers. And so I was really interested in this kind of, I'm really interested in this kind of dual role people play as both victim and perpetrator, if we want to use kind of criminal language. But yeah, I'm just interested in kind of when people are kind of sitting on both sides in contradictory and really, I think, very sad. I think that's how I got into it, is trying to understand, like, well, why? Why would anyone join the military? It's not something I've ever considered for myself. Yeah, and that's probably my first kind of entry into this line of questioning.
Well, we are, let me speak for everyone around the world and just say, we're very fortunate to have you working on this. I'm really excited to look more into the work through you, learn from you, and hopefully we can all get our hands on the dissertation sometime soon. Appreciate you.
I'd like to get my hands on it myself. So.
Okay, so we're going to move forward now. We're going to move to Nate Holdren. Hello, Nate.
Hello.
Welcome to the fold. Nate's, again, just for everybody who's joining us now, going to be talking for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to discussion and Q&A. Great.
Cool. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Jasmine. That was great. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So, hi, everybody. I'm Nate. I wrote this chapter in the book. It's on social murder. So, social murder is a term that Engels uses in his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845. And basically, Engels says, I've done a lot of research and I'm noticing that working class people are dying in all these appalling ways and living a lot shorter lives and lives full of suffering. That's not an accident. And he calls it social murder. And what I try to do in the chapter, in part, is to say this isn't a rhetorical flourish on Engels's part. This is a theory. Capitalism is a necessarily death-dealing system. And Marx builds on that theory. Marx doesn't use the phrase, to the best of my knowledge, but Marx praises Engels' book extensively. He's in Volume 1 of Capital, explicitly, and in correspondence with Engels. And he says directly in correspondence with Engels, Fred, you really got to update your book. It's so good. It remains current. I used it in writing my book. My book gets us partway to an update, but you really need to update it. He clearly thought it was a huge contribution. Unfortunately, Engels never got around to writing that update. But and I argue that we find in particularly the chapter on the working day and the chapter on machinery in Volume 1 of Capital and a short section on industrial accidents in Volume 3 of Capital, we see that Marx is working with this theory of social murder, I argue, even though it's not explicitly thematized that way. So what do I mean by social murder? Social murder is a tendency for capitalism to generate death, harm, suffering, disablement, and above all, death within the working class. And this is baked into capitalist social relations. So capitalism is a necessarily lethal social system. So this has several facets that I want to tease out here. One is there's a tendency to deprivation built into being a member of the working class, being a member of the proletariat. So you need stuff to live, and you need, let alone live a good life. And in capitalism, you can't get stuff unless you have money, and there's no guaranteed access to money, certainly not to a sufficient quantity of money. So what that means is that the stuff you need to live is of only conditional access. So there's already baked in a necessary deprivation inflicted on some people if people will go without things that they need regularly. And it's the effort to avoid that deprivation, which is part of what drives so many of us into jobs. So we sell our labor power in order to get money, in order to then buy means of subsistence. And it's the fact that means of subsistence is commodified, and access to money. You need money to get a commodity, and access to money is not guaranteed. So that's like the lash that drives us into selling our labor power to a significant degree. The purpose of social production in capitalism is not to meet human needs. It's to turn money into more money. Marx calls it for value to valorize itself. It's to capitalists to make their investments prove profitable. So all other social priorities are secondary to that. And I want to underline that this is a necessary process in the organization of capitalist social relations. It's not a matter of moral failings. Don't get me wrong. The world is lousy with moral failings, but those moral failings are generated by the social architecture. They're not the cause of the social architecture. I think that Marx is a profound moral critic, and he hates the moral ill character that this system generates, but that's a symptom. It's not a cause. Because human well-being is not a priority, other things are. Human well-being is ill-served. That's part of the broad overview, sort of the broad point. So in our jobs, people endure very serious occupational injuries and illness. We see COVID is absolutely occupational illness that's spread in workplaces. In my own workplace, Today, I have an office at work. I came into work. I was a little distracted when Jasmine first started because I'm in a building that's not being well maintained, and when it rains in the corner of my office, and that was happening as Jasmine was starting to talk. I have a coworker. This is a little bit silly and annoying. Maybe my papers get a little wet. It's not a big deal to me, but I have a coworker who has really serious respiratory problems, and the mold that results from this causes that person really serious health problems. So that's just a very small example. That in the production process, in our employment, we are exposed to harms. We're exposed to Marx and Engels list a great deal of vectors of harm: overcrowding, lack of ventilation, too much heat, exposure to machinery, exposure to electricity, exposure to chemicals. There's also just the sheer repetition of the labor process. At one point, I worked in a factory. I worked in the warehouse attached to a factory. I put cell phones in boxes for 8.5 hours. I did this for about 11 hours a night. And I then moved to the loading dock. But if I were to do that for many years, it would destroy my shoulder joint because I would do this hundreds of times an hour for, often with overtime, 11 hours a night. So the labor process exposes us to harms, and in important ways, the labor process is harm because it's consuming our lifetime, it's consuming our time and energy, it's consuming our labor power, and in ways that we don't control. So you can't stop to rest very often. You can't control that there's enough, that there's safety mechanisms, that there's rubber mats if you're standing on concrete, that temperature, et cetera. And all of this was getting worse with climate change as well. So there's harms built into the production process because the purpose of production is profit, and safety mechanisms are costly. Democratic control by workers to mitigate the health effects of production are costly. It's a deduction from profit. So there's tremendous pressure from employers to cut corners. And the fact that we need money to get the stuff that we need to live means that our employers have tremendous power over us. So workers are regularly faced with choices. Do I endure these degrading and harmful conditions now and have security of income, or do I push back and risk my income? And workers face that trade-off constantly. In addition to harms in the production process and the threat of deprivation that's baked into status as a member of the working class, there are also harmful products. I was just reading recently, randomly, as there's been growing legalization of hallucinogenic mushrooms in the United States, there's been a niche market in selling edibles that you can microdose mushrooms with. Well, there was just a toxic, because it's poorly regulated, there was just a toxic version of that product that killed, I think, 27 people. We're seeing this now with, I live in the state of Iowa, and they've legalized raw milk, and there's extensive testing that raw milk is more likely to contain H5N1 bird flu. So the list goes on. There's lots and lots of harmful products, and the presence of harmful products is the result of the fact that social need, quality of the product is not democratically decided upon. It's not coordinated, and it's simply not the purpose. The purpose of production is for the good to be saleable profitably. And when the incentives align to make the product safe, we'll see some degree of safety. When they don't, we won't. Now, there are, of course, state regulatory mechanisms. Those are themselves under serious pressure over the long term from the imperative to turn a profit. Jasmine said militaries are creatures of the societies in which they're embedded. That's true generally of the state. The state in capitalism is a specifically capitalist state, and the regulatory arm of the capitalist state is itself a creature of capitalist social relations. And so regulation can't mitigate fully the tendency to create harmful products. It tends to work retroactively after harm has happened. There's then a catching up process. That goes for regulation in the wage workplace as well. So there's just a degree of harm that's baked in. It's naturalized within capitalist societies. Another facet of that are what economists sometimes call negative externalities, meaning a harm to a third party who's not a member of the transaction, to put it in very abstract language. Put a little more straightforwardly, I live about 1.5 miles from a Firestone and Bridgestone tire factory. There's a big fucking smokestack coming off the top of it. I don't know what's coming out of it. I don't love that my 3 children breathe that shit in every day. It's where I can afford to live. I like where I live. I really like my neighborhood. I like my neighbors a lot. But we're very close to that stuff, and we're breathing that stuff in. And I'm not involved in any direct transaction with that tire factory. They're making tires and selling them to automobile manufacturers. And I just happen to live nearby. And so there's a waste product to the production process. That waste product happens to enter the social domain where I live, and the company is indifferent to that. I don't appear to them because the way in which they steer is through monetary transactions. And I'm not a monetary transactor with that company. This Marx and Engels talk, they give us some examples of this, of train derailments, which has unfortunately become very salient again in the present. We had that awful derailment in Ohio. The train went off the rails and all this toxic shit went up into the air, poisoned a lot of people. This happens all the time. To a significant degree, auto accidents involving trucks on the highways, these are all forms of harm that are baked into the spaces outside of the direct production process in our time off the clock. But people tend to be exposed to harms in those social situations because, again, the purpose of production is to serve profits, and the purpose of society in capitalism is to make sure that enough productive units continue to profit, so that enough units stay in business that we can all keep our jobs, or some of us can keep our jobs. Another form of social murder, another form of harm that the system generates is, I mentioned initially that there's a form of deprivation built into being a member of the working class as such. There's just a threat. You're not going to have what you want and need in the quantities in which you want and need it unless you have a job. Very likely, if you have a job, you still won't have it fully in the quantity in which you need it. There's a line I find very, very powerful by a rock band from Minnesota called the Dillinger Four. They have a song. There's a line that says, "This isn't what we want. This isn't what we need. It's what we can afford." It speaks to me personally a lot, especially as I have 3 kids now. As I've started to have kids, I've found that harder and harder to face. I provide my kids the best that I can afford, but that isn't always the best life that they deserve. Because I can't afford to provide them the best life that they deserve. So there's that form of deprivation, and there's a second form of deprivation that's built in, which has to do with how social investment is steered. So Jasmine and I are both wearing glasses. We have an impairment that is, for people of our class status in the countries where we live, relatively affordable to take care of. There are folks in poverty who can't afford corrective lenses and so on. But there are other impairments that are much more expensive, or that are not where there aren't devices currently. But we have the technical capacity to develop the ability to alleviate those impairments, but there's not social investment in that, because the well-being of ordinary folks, the well-being of anybody, is not a social priority. And so that, again, that creates the deprivations that I mentioned, the immediate deprivations. We can't have enough of what's immediately available. There's a mediated secondary form of deprivation with regard to the steering of social investment, though, which is that what's going to be made available, research in developing new products, research in developing future capacity, and so on, will not be directed at pressing human needs and so on. It'll be directed at what's going to be profitable. And so that creates an additional form of deprivation. And all of this, there's 2 final things I want to say on elements of social murder. There's also a structural unemployment. Marx calls it relative surplus population, which is an ugly and cruel phrase, but it gets at an ugly and cruel reality. People become essentially, I'm sorry to put it this way, but this is the logic of the system. From the point of view of the system, people become useless eaters, just mouths to feed, probably best if they're socially discarded, according to the logic of the system and the people who run the system. So there's a baked-in degree of unemployment, which means a baked-in population who will be especially deprived of what they need. And there's also there's a tendency toward periodic crises of various kinds, which tend to push people out of employment, cutting off people's incomes and so people's access to what they want and need. This happens at large scales all the time. This also happens, not all the time. This happens periodically at large scales, and this happens at small scales all the time. Like I said, I came into my workplace for my office because I live in a relatively small house with 3 wonderful but very loud children, and they're all on the internet. So I wanted to come in here to make sure that my connection would be stable and so that it would be quieter. And I ran into a coworker who's clearing out their office because they've been laid off because nothing personal, it's the budget. So that person I'm very sad personally to see them go. I have a worse life myself at work, but they're being gone and they're going to have less income. We were talking about their job search right before the panel started and what they're going to do and so on. So that's in a microcosm. People get laid off all the time because, again, the point of the system is profits and everything else is secondary to that point. This also leads to environmental harms. We're seeing this with climate change, and then there become kind of reverberations of these harms. I saw a fantastic talk a while ago by the UK-based disability scholar named Luke Beasley. He used this very powerful phrase, misfortunes hunt in packs. So the way I would put it is we live on the side of a mountain and shit rolls downhill. And if you're at the bottom of the hill, the more shit you get on you, the more shit you will get on you. So my coworker who's just been laid off needs to find some health insurance, needs to scramble to find a paycheck. Scrambling to find those things creates additional vulnerabilities to future harms. I've also heard this put, it's expensive to be poor. So there's these reverberations of harm. Okay, so that's the tendency of the system to kill. You may be asking, what's this have to do with the state? Why is this in a chapter? Why is this a chapter in a book on the capitalist state? So Jasmine used the phrasing is very effective. The state is the political form of capitalist social relations. Capitalism is not an economy. Capitalism is a type of society. One domain is the economic, another domain is the political. And in capitalism, the state is a specifically capitalist state. They hang together. The separation between the political and the economic is real, but it's more complicated than it sometimes looks like. It needs to be itself contextualized. Lots of other chapters in the book do that better than I can do. But basically, the state serves the ongoing turning of money into more money. The state serves the profit imperative. Again, as I said earlier, that's not due to the moral failings of the personnel involved. And as I said, but to reiterate, they are lousy with moral failings. We are ruled by the worst fucking people in the whole world. But the lives that we lead are not the results of the fact that our ruling class is so depraved. Ruling class depravity is generated by the social architecture. It's not, at most, the moral depravity of the ruling class is a secondary effect that produces feedback loops that reinforces the fundamental dynamics of the system. But you can put the most saintly people in the world in charge of all of the social institutions. You get minor benefits in the short term, and to be fair, minor benefit, given the scales of harms we're talking about, involve very many people getting to live longer. So those quote-unquote minor benefits are very, very serious. But put those people in charge, they won't stay saints very long, and the system will still act the same way it does in the long term. It's a systemic set of problems. So the state's systemic relationship to production is that the state needs to keep profit continuing to flow. It's an imperative that acts on the state. It isn't a choice, and it's not a matter of subjective values or morality or anything like that. If profits aren't made at a widespread enough across the society, people lose jobs. Enterprises go out of business, and the kinds of harms that I'm talking about intensify. So the state, another way to put it, the state is a force for relative order and preserving the relative order that we have. The order that we have in a capitalist society is a specifically capitalist order. And so the state, in preserving order, must preserve the functioning of capitalist social relations. And as I've laid out in the long first part of my talk, that is a murderous order. Capitalism is a death machine. The state is fully of that machine and is a part, despite the intentions of a lot of state personnel, but those intentions are largely irrelevant. The state is an accomplice to social murder and a defender of the death machine. Now, people may say, well, what about various regulations and so on? Fair enough. What tends to happen is that medium, small instances, localized instances of social murder, when politicized by activist groups that make a lot of trouble, the state can step in to mitigate those harms. The mitigation is almost always partial. But again, the partiality of those mitigations, the mitigating actions of the state on social murder have real stakes in people's lives, and I very much get that, and I'm not trying to minimize that. However, the mitigated forms of social murder that our liberals want to call success stories are still soaked in blood, and they are not sufficient to what human dignity deserves. And even a mitigated capitalism will continue to kill. But again, it's not that people are stupid for demanding those mitigations. And it's not that those mitigations are meaningless. It's that they're structurally limited, but of course people fight for them because it's literally life or death. So, so when there's political action, when there's activism, when there's troublemaking by sufferers from specific kinds of social murder, people who suffer from black lung disease, the AIDS crisis, you name it, there will be local action to help those folks to a limited extent. But when the scale of social murder is large enough, the state can't stop it. We saw this with the 2008-2009 financial crisis. The economy melted down. My dad was out of work for 2 years. He almost lost his house. And he came through relatively unscathed compared to a lot of people. When the harm gets that big, the state essentially can't act sufficiently without starting to break from capitalist social relations. And that's not going to happen absent a revolutionary movement of workers. So there's a way in which, and the COVID pandemic is another example, there's a way in which specific expressions of social murder become too big to fail, and the state can only aid them. So medium, small expressions of social murder that are localized, when politicized through social struggle, the state may step in. But if they get bigger than that, the state primarily begins to say, hey, calm down. Liberalism is very, very good at this. Hey, don't panic. Just act through the institutions. I'm going to stop in a minute, but what state institutions tend to do, though, is they tend to demobilize, specifically because they, in a specific fashion. They don't demobilize absolutely, but they demobilize in the sense that they direct people toward forms of social action that do not interrupt the imperative to profit. Typically, the most effective forms of social protest disrupt economic life. They prevent the turning of money into more money. And state institutions work to prevent that disruption. And often that prevention takes the form of, here's an institutional channel to deal with the problem that you've raised. And those mechanisms work somewhat for a while, and then they trail off. They don't work as well later because of the pressures of the social system on them. But even when they're working, though, they fragment people. This is a program for black lung disease sufferers. This is a program for AIDS patients. This is a program for people with silicosis. This is a program for, here's a fund for people who live a mile and a half from that Bridgetown and Firestone plant, which we're finding out puts all these carcinogens in the air. So if you live within a mile and a half of that plant, here's some money for you. If you're 2 miles out, get fucked, right? So there's these fragmentations that happen, which prevent people from knitting together. They don't absolutely prevent, but they press in the direction. They press against people knitting together in larger collectivities and identifying shared interests beyond these very, very localized forms of harm. So the state is an accomplice to social murder ultimately. And, there's the old slogan, socialism or barbarism. My chapter is in part just sort of underlining that. As long as the system continues to exist, people will die, and I don't mean that metaphorically. I'm going to stop in just a minute. A few years ago, there was the police murdered George Floyd, and there was a massive uprising. I used to live not far from where that happened. I live in Des Moines now, but I spent a lot of time. I was very affected by it. I mean, a lot of us were affected by it around the world, but I was thrown by seeing that in a place that I had been many, many times. And as part of just looking into that, the neighborhood where the pigs murdered George Floyd has about an 8-year lower life expectancy than a neighborhood a mile or two west, and it tracks exactly with the incomes and the racial background and the class background of people who live there. So that's an additional form of social murder. It's just that a lot of people die sooner along class lines. In the United States, it's about last I looked, it's about 8 to 10-year difference between the lowest fifth income group and the upper fifth income group. So literally, you just have a shorter life full of more suffering in capitalism, and that's not accidental. That's baked in. So that's the gist of my chapter. I do want to just say I love Jasmine's emphasis on cooperative labor and antagonism. I will say that's the shortcoming of my chapter. So if you read it, it's an account of what I think are the objective logic of the system and the outcomes that it will generate, and the ways in which state institutional channels prevent antagonism. They maybe provide an appearance of antagonism or a mitigated form of antagonism, but they largely prevent the kinds of struggle that are really necessary, in my view. But I don't really talk very much about these being contested processes and there being antagonism throughout. That is a thing I believe. It's a thing I wasn't sure I couldn't figure out how to put that in the chapter. So that's something in maybe in the Q&A we could talk about, and if folks read it in further conversation, coming out of this event, hopefully, I would love to hear more about how to integrate the analysis that I've given into an analysis that is more open-ended, more driven, by a concept of antagonism and struggle. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nate. That was great. I'm glad you brought up Dillinger 4. Kind of between the two talks today, one of my favorite Dillinger 4 quotes is, "Time was a war. Time, economy, was a silver lining to tragedy." And feels like we're all sort of, unfortunately, enmeshed and covered in this tragedy today, maybe mountingly so. Maybe double back on a metaphor you used before. Shit rolls downhill, and the more shit you get covered in, the more it attracts. So as someone who is covered in shit, metaphorically speaking, I'm curious what sort of drove you towards your interest in social murder as a concept itself, like personally. Like, what was it that was there what compelled that? And it kind of sits alongside your previous work around and continuing work around injury and law. I'm just interested.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate it. So how did I get entirely by accident and stumbling backward? I'm 45 years old. I'm about to turn 46. I'm a product of the tail end of the anti-globalization movement and the anti-war movement, such as it was, coming out of the aftermath of September 11, 2001. And I was radicalized during those processes, and I've been a Marxist for a very long time. I really struggled in the job market, and after a while I went to grad school on the thought that it would be I was out of school for about 5 years between undergrad and grad school, and the thought was it would be a way to get a better job. I didn't know very much about how universities work at the time when I thought that, but being a product of those movements and being a Marxist, I did not intend to work on this stuff. I was going to work on labor history and a kind of up with people, worker self-activity kind of story. And I just randomly found some stuff about workplace injury and law, and continued to stumble backward trying to make sense of it. And it became very compelled by this subject. So I wrote this book on employee injury law. The short version, for folks who haven't read the book, things used to be really bad and worse than you think, but then later they were differently really bad and worse than you think. And I say that flippantly, but it's also true. And as I was working on the book, I remembered that I had been hurt myself. I had a few hundred pounds of lumber fall on me in a factory I worked at when I was 18, and my father's a construction worker. My mom has gone back and forth in the warehouse industry into other work, and then back to the warehouse industry. She wore a back brace for years when I was a kid because she'd been hurt when she was young, working in a warehouse. And she's in the last couple of years she's broken her foot and had hip surgery due to other injuries in the warehouse she works in now. So that hasn't changed. But I was very far into the book, and I was like, my grandma was secretary and destroyed her wrist with carpal tunnel syndrome from repetitive stress injury. So I was really far into the book, and I was like, everybody in my family, like in my immediate family, has really serious occupational injury and illness story. And I never thought about it. I didn't even really notice it. It was just sort of this fact of life. I had to write most of a book manuscript to really even start to reflect on it. So then it felt very above my pay grade to write that book, and I threw everything I could into it. I threw song lyrics, I threw interviews with comedians I read, and just because it was so hard to make sense of, given my limited capacities. And I found I heard an interview where someone used the phrase social murder to describe the Grenfell Tower fire in the UK. If folks aren't familiar with that, it's a public housing building that was coated in insulation that was basically napalm, and residents said for a very, very long time, this is very, very dangerous. You need to not do it. You need to change this. And they're poor people, so who gives a shit? So eventually the local council didn't do anything, and eventually what people said would happen happened, and the building caught fire and a bunch of people died. And in the aftermath, there were people who were reaching to Engels' analysis saying this is social murder, and they're absolutely right. And there's been some very interesting research by a trio, I cite them in my chapter, by a trio of public health researchers saying Grenfell Tower has brought a lot of people's attention back to Engels into the category of social murder, and myself included. I've been a Marxist since the late 90s. I only read Engels' book in 2020, 2021, because I had for a long time had this sense of, Marx is where the action's really at. Marx is Batman, Engels is Robin. Why would you spend time with Robin? And that's completely false. I mean, I wish I had read this book much, much sooner. But so I finished my book and was like, so that social murder thing, I wonder if anyone's written about that. And then I looked it up, and Engels had. And so then I just wanted to make sense of this. And so I just kept thinking it through. But yeah, so that's how, again, it largely by accident, by the time I was working, I finished my book before the COVID pandemic. My work on social murder began before the pandemic, but has really come out during the pandemic, and that has also very much colored my understanding of the category. So it's partly, stumbling backwards, trying to respond to what's happening in the world, but it was never a plan on my part. And I've continually been like, oh man, I wish I'd have figured this out 10 years ago. So.
Well, we're figuring it out now.
Yeah.
Now is never too late. Thanks again for that talk. Quite fascinating. Obviously, some of you might not know I'm a Nate Holdren super fan, so he has to endure all my questions and interests frequently online. So thank you for that as well. But happy to have you both here.
I don't experience something I have to endure, but thank you.
Would like to have you, before we get on to Q&A, and again, just a reminder, if you got questions, send them in the chat, send them via Twitter, Facebook, text, whatever. I've gotten like 6 texts from Red May people just over this talk with tons of questions. So before we do that, I'd really be interested in hearing the two of you, if you have any questions or thoughts or considerations on each other's presentations. I think this might be a great time to return to that, maybe looking for synchrony between the cooperativity and state and social cooperativity and antagonism that it generates and defers. And several of the questions that I'm seeing thus far also point to, I think, maybe something all of us can recognize, which is that categories of social murder and military securitization, force securitization in general. There seems to be a lot in common there. So curious what you all might have in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also a Nate super fan. As we're both, I don't know if this was part of our organizing process, but we have the two Angles heads here. Yeah, trying to redeem our boy. But yeah, Nate, I had so many thoughts that came up during your great talk, even though I've, heard versions and read the chapter and listened to you talk about this several times before. And particularly, I guess, just like the awful relevance of this. About a year ago, I think it was. Yeah, a year ago, a childhood friend of mine posted on Instagram that his cousin, who's only 32, suffered really terrible burns at work at this one of the big steel plants in Hamilton, Ontario, where I used to live, Stelco. And so my friend's cousin and his coworker had really bad burns from steam, and they both ultimately passed away from those burns. And then just a couple days ago, Stelco and John Kenny Unlimited, which was, I think, the contractor that had kind of, I don't know, how factory work, like everything else, is kind of has been reorganized so that no one is ultimately an employer. But both were charged for these two workers' deaths, which is a part of what I've learned from so much of your work is how rare that is, and how also unjust it is, even when employers are charged for deaths and injuries of their workers. Because like I just think of like in your book, like what monetary value would you put on like if your dad worked their whole life and has had hip replacements and back problems, and like every time you see him in pain in his back, like what's the dollar value of that? His employer knows, they've calculated it, and it's one of these things that's just like so the moral outrage I always feel when I hear your work presented, because it's it's a personal crisis, it's a personal emergency, it's a personal accident, but for the society we live in, it's calculated into how we operate, right? That there will be that someone you love will be hurt or die, and that's just like, well, you need to replace this the ceiling on this building in X amount of years. It's just part of the calculus, and I think that that should outrage us all, and I think that's why people connect with your work so much, because we can all relate to it in some way.
Thank you. I mean, it goes for your stuff too. I had a buddy when I was working on my book. He called me up. He was working at the time. He was working on construction, and he was the guy who put the orange barrels out on the highway to tell you to move over a lane because they're working on the shoulder. And he was like, "Yeah, we just got a big contract for revamping this such and such highway." And I thought of you because the plan is by the end of they're estimating that by the end of the project, 8 guys will die, and so we've got $1 million budget to pay for the cost of that. It's just built into the budget. And I mean, in your work, this is absolutely true as well. I mean, like this military misadventure will happen, and this number of soldiers will die, and there's not even a calculation of the number of civilians that'll die. And so that the ways in which so I don't know. So there's some way when we talk about I'm newly confused about ideology. There's perpetually, but once again, and I think ideology is a real social phenomenon. I think it's a really important category and so on. On the other hand, a lot of what happens in society seems to me to result from just sort of patterns of how we live. There's just E.P. Thompson and Raymond Williams both talk this way. They say social. It comes out of Marx. Social being determines social consciousness, not vice versa. So if you want to understand what people think, you got to look at how people live holistically. And so to an important extent, there are ideologies that are shaping what people think in an open-ended way, but also to an important extent, the patterns of social practice that we just live out on a routine basis in our society also generate these ideological forms of consciousness. And I'm a college professor at a mid-tier teaching school. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I'm a rare example of relative class mobility. And the downside is that I work with a lot of middle class people, a lot of people who grew up middle class. And it's made me think more about kind of the class determination of what people think. Because I've repeatedly when I give talks about my book, I would say, this isn't over. My book's a history of the early 20th century for folks who haven't read it. So, but I try to stress, it's an in-depth examination of that period, but it's not really over. People are still dying all the time in workplaces. Last time I looked it up, in the United States, about 5,000 reported occupational fatalities per year. And so I said, that's 5,000 people a year dying every year. And I've repeatedly had people, I can tell people's class background, because I've repeatedly had people from a certain class background be like, well, that's not a big number. There's 333 million Americans. And every time that's happened, I sort of politely feel out where people are coming from. That's because for folks who say stuff like that, that's 5,000 of them over there. It's not 5,000 of us. Mm-hmm. And that's just a kind of gut level sensibility. Like I said, every member of my family has been hurt in a workplace injury, and often more than once. And so I see that 5,000 and I think, that's my niece and my nephew when they grow up. Mm-hmm. That's my brothers. That's my dad. That's my mom. It has been them. And so I think but that's not solely a matter of kind of free-floating ideology. It's also a matter of those folks' life experiences. If you grow up, if you're a rich kid from the suburbs, you probably don't know anybody who's had that in a direct way. You don't know anybody who's been subjected to the economic draft. You don't know anybody who's had bombs dropped on them in another country. You don't know any, immigrants, because people's class status. People live further up the hill, less shit falls on them. So I'd be interested in hearing kind of your thoughts about the degree to which ideology is an important force in the military or in military culture, or maybe it's not. Maybe, because this is something I keep changing my mind about. When I first walked into this kind of work, I thought, well, ideology would be really important, and then I've increasingly been kind of like, I really think it's just ideology is important, but it's less important than I thought. I think it's much more that these social patterns in how we live give rise to forms of ideology, which then help defend those patterns, and they have secondary kind of feedback effects, but they're not as determinant as I thought they might be. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that made any sense, but do you have any thoughts?
I think so. I mean, I think it makes sense as a question. Do I have any thoughts? I don't know. I feel like, I used to be like much more kind of, I feel like, dogmatic about this. I was like, well, I'm interested in the stuff that's like objectively killing people, I think there's something I'm self-critical about now, but like when I was an undergrad and was like, I want the goriest, bloodiest shit. And now I'm the opposite. And I'm like, oh, why didn't I study literature? Why didn't I study that? But I don't know, but ideology is one of the things that came to mind when you were talking, precisely about when you're talking about the state as an accomplice to social murder. I think we can't underestimate how much ideology is produced through the state. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not, I guess I just don't see it as two separate functions. I think actions are also kind of ideological. Like, I don't know, I think ideology doesn't just happen in culture or the written word or something. Like, think of how, like, you were talking about dividing and segmenting people through like hyper-specific benefits. that's so ideological. And I mean, I thought of the military. Like, there's a great, fantastic historian named Jennifer Middlestat, and she has a great book on the welfare state within the U.S. Army and how it was constructed in the 20th century, and then dismantled like everything else in neoliberalism. But like, soldiers' benefits and veterans' benefits aren't what they once were, but there's still there's so much ideology around the military in this country, especially, that is such that you can't have public benefits that like surpass what is available to veterans and soldiers, which are shit now, like are shit, because there isn't a broader social safety net. So like, you can't give like the proles something better than what like the most deserving and the heroes get, because that's insulting. Like, that'll always be like an ideological maneuver that's available, right? And so it's important to like keep that ceiling low also, because you can't ask for what is more than what like a veteran gets, even if like in reality the state does not give a shit about like working class veterans, as we all know from seeing people living on the street, and or even through personal connections. Like, I just think I'm not like an ideology expert, but I think it is extremely important, and definitely not something that is separate from the kind of what we see as more kind of concrete or the repressive aspects of the state. I think they really are firmly hand in hand. Does that make sense?
Completely. That's really thought-provoking. I'm going to keep cogitating on that after our conversation is done today. I really appreciate it. I think maybe for me, I've been sort of, part of the issue is I've been thinking my way out of a less generative way to think about ideology and into a new one. And I've done more of the unthinking and less of the new direction. But I think you're absolutely right. It's not a separate process, and forms of action are themselves ideological. That's very thought-provoking. Thank you for that.
Well, that's always a process, right? Like,
yeah.
And I think we also, like, as people in the world, like, even if like you and I professionally think, as embarrassing as that is, we also think in the rest of our lives and the real world, and that's always a process, and we're ourselves affected by what our environment is. Like, are we in an organization? Are we actively political or not? Is the only politics we're doing, like right now, I feel like the only politics I'm doing is just like, I'm just writing my dissertation and doing academic stuff. And I feel like how that affects my thinking versus like when I was really active in my union or something. Like, but it also changes over time. So I think we're always a work in progress. Not to be like a live, laugh, love about it, but I think that's true.
I appreciate it. Thank you for that. I had one other thought, not directly related, but John, we were talking about Dillinger 4. Jasmine, you may know there's a band from Canada. As an American, I say propaganda. Canadians say propaganda. And I'm embarrassed by how much I think about bands like this all the time, but I'm trying to stop being embarrassed, because I think that there aren't. Well, let me back up. So Propaganda has this incredible song called Iteration, and it's a fantasy of Donald Rumsfeld being on trial for war crimes. And the first line is Donald wept through the proceedings. And it has a line when he's sentenced for war crimes. There's a line that says, how can one man ever repay a debt so appalling you can't gouge 10,000 eyes from a single head? And then in the end, they sentence him to spend the rest of his life diffusing landmines. But I think about that all the time, because it partly gets at how, and there's a Horkheimer quote, I forget the exact wording, but it's something like, when the new society finally exists, it's not going to redeem all the people destroyed by the society that preceded it, the society we currently live in. And there's no repaying. Like, I'm terribly sorry for your friend's loss that you mentioned. Like, there's no repaying that. Like, people just have to, like, that's just part of who they are now. Like that suffering, that harm, that grief, that never goes away. And there's no quid pro quo, anything like that. Though we're ideologically offered lots of quid pro quos. And part of why I like that Propaganda song so much is it sort of gets into that. Like this isn't the realm of equivalence. And what I was going to say is I think that shit, like I said, shit rolls downhill, and the kinds of harms that we're talking about are often swept under the rug within elite circles and official circles. And so it's not even like that they're called acceptable. It's just that they're not called anything at all. And I think the kinds of things that do raise them tend to be in kind of quote unquote low cultures, vernacular cultures. My age and geography are showing, but for me, it was kind of local punk in the 90s and early aughts, but there are other examples. There's nothing really bad happens to people who matter in this society. And if you're someone who matters and something bad happens to you, in the process, you're stripped of mattering. Like you were an important person, and then this happened to you. Now you live at the bottom of the mountain among the rest of the plebs. Like that's sort of the process. And so I think like the forms of meaning making that we have for thinking about that stuff are themselves tend to live among folks who are at the bottom of the mountain and are less. They're kind of. The reason I find this stuff embarrassing is because I'm noticing that my references are low references, and I'm surrounded by middle-class people who have high references. That's sort of my thought on that.
I don't think it's embarrassing.
Fair enough. It shouldn't.
Go ahead, be embarrassed. Why not?
I mean, I'm a lifelong Midwesterner, so that's just my culture. But yeah.
I also, Sean, I'm getting the vibe that you want to say something, but I just want to ask Nate, also while you were talking, I wonder if you have read Marta Jimenez's essay on population in capitalism.
No.
It's originally from 1977, but it's also in her, the Brill edition of her book. I can send you the link, but it's called Population and Capitalism, and her book is Marx, Women, and Capitalist Social Reproduction from the Brill Haymarket Historic Materialism series. Great book. You can often get like a cheap copy in the Haymarket sales. But it's a great chapter that talks about kind of, the idea of like always this kind of the super racist and bullshit idea of like a population problem, especially in the global South, which is it's for her. It's she's focused on Latin America. And it's a great essay that basically makes the argument that like there is no population question in capitalism because capitalism has ways of dealing with not being able to feed everyone, which is letting them die. So it's actually not a question for capitalism. And when it becomes kind of an issue for capitalism, it has these things where you can increase mortality basically for the surplus populations. And then what I think is really, important in this chapter, in this article, she says like in socialism, there might be a population problem because the premise of a socialist society would be that it actually does matter if people have enough to eat, if there's a scarcity, if, that is actually a premise of socialism, is that we want everyone to have a good life and, not live horrific, avoidable deaths, et cetera, et cetera. And I always think it's a great essay for that reason, because it's like actually not an issue for capitalist society if we have too many people, because we don't care about the quality of most people's lives and whether they live or die, especially in the global South. But in socialism, it actually is a question. And I think it's a great chapter for thinking through these things. So it reminded me a lot of your premises in your discussion of social murder, which I don't think is a concept that she talks about. But I think it might be fruitful or provoking or interesting for you to read.
I'm going to read it. Thank you for the recommendation. And Sean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I had another thought in response to Jasmine. So this has been on my mind kind of off and on in various ways, but it occurred to me again as you're talking. So I'm not sure about this, and this is probably anyway, let me say, I'm qualifying before I say it. in my opinion, we live in a society that's a death machine, and I think that in important ways, I'm talking about the kind of depoliticized economic elements of that, and you're talking about the politicized, the other elements of that are organized somewhat differently, but they're two halves of a whole. And it something I say a lot, but I say it with more confidence than I have. A society that's a death machine is also a society for producing ghouls who are okay with all the death. And so I think in addition to all the killing, there's a production of people who were relatively inured, I think that's the word, relatively inured to the killing, and resources to help them live with themselves. And so some people will just get marked for death, and other people will get paid for playing roles in that. And they get things that help them live with, like, this is a common question. Well, how do they live with themselves? And it's this kind of rhetorical question that's an expression of our very understandable outrage at all these harm and loss. But that actually is a practical problem. How do they live with themselves? And that's a problem that's answered directly through a host of forms of ideological production. And I would imagine this shows up even more in your stuff in the military, of like, how do you make sure people are willing to kill and die, or send other people to kill and die? But I see it in my own work, in my immediate workplace. Like I said, they laid off a coworker. There've been a bunch of layoffs here at work. We've tried to push back on some of it. We've been a mixed bag. But the fact that folks who run this place think in terms of budgets and dollars and cents and so on just means they don't even have to notice the reality. Like I said, my coworker who was here when I walked in, who's just been laid off, was thinking about retiring in a year or two, is going to have a different and worse life for the next few years. Hopefully everything works out well. I think they're going to be okay. But it is a real harm. And like the folks who made that decision in a set of terms that insulate them from any of the concerns that I just mentioned. And so that sort of like perceptual insulation, that's on my mind a lot. And then you were talking about the kind of racist population rhetoric and so on. Like, that's another way I think of being like, hey, those people at the bottom of the hill who were discarded, I'm okay with that. Here's why. And I think some of the time there's a sort of non-perception, and other times there's a sort of active, like, well, fuck them, they deserve it. But that's on my mind. That's sort of the thing that coming out the other side of this project that I continue to be preoccupied with. I thought of it as you were talking, so I wanted to mention it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've just lived through a year, and I mean, it's ongoing, of like watching genocide unfold before our eyes and hearing the ideology machine go absolutely insane over it. Connected obviously with the like repressive institutions, as we saw, like protests and so on. But I think that question of how do they live with themselves is like a question I feel like I ask myself generally, like when I think about kind of the mundane manifestations of all this kind of violence, right? I think about like, oh, I need to buy a new pair of shoes. And then I'm just like, a child makes my shoes, like it's, and their family probably lives next to the toxic fumes that come out of the factory where my shoes are made, just like your children, right? Like, this is why I think, on the left generally, but as Marxists, as socialists, we can't afford to not think about international politics at all times, because, yeah, the social murder is globalized as well, and I think, but that also so there's an ideological component, but there's also a structural component, right? Like when you have a conscript army, you have to face that, and you're part of it. You have to face that question more head on, of like, I'm in this thing, it's out of my choice, like it's out of my hands. A volunteer army, the question is asked kind of before being in the institution, but also we've seen the American soldier who self-immolated this year, Aaron Bushnell, he answered that question in a way where he said he couldn't. In a very horrifying, violent way, he answered that question in a different way. And some people just leave. Some people decide like, this isn't for me. Some people decide that in other kind of lines of work as well. I think it's something we do confront regularly in our society, in small and big ways, and in ways that are less noticeable or less politicized. sometimes we're just like, the job market shit, I'm leaving academia, Sometimes people unionize their workplace. Sometimes people do all kinds of things. But I think it is a really important question, and one that we can ask in ways that's not disempowering. I shouldn't be consuming this much. It's like, well, I probably shouldn't. Do I have options? Maybe not. I don't know. But I think it is a great question. It's relevant in a whole bunch of different ways at different scales. I don't know if that was even relevant to what you just asked.
It was great. Sean, you were going to say something.
I'm just going to jump in. You all are having a great discussion. I feel like this could go on for a while, and appreciate
please impose some order.
We're just going to try and I'm going to maybe throw some questions together that we've received. Kind of been working on mixing and mingling those with some questions I already had myself. And then we'll try to maybe get out of here in the next 15 minutes if that works for you all, 15, 20. How would I, well, sorry, I just got a text from somebody asking about how the particular command structure between both of the contexts that you all are working in. And Jasmine, we got some comments in the chat from YouTube as well, asking about the broader expression of command economy that we might find in a military hierarchy that has, or perceivably is inherited from capitalist social relations, or at least mediated by them. For me, not only thinking about an immediate context like what's going on in Gaza, the genocidal apartheid that's going on in Gaza, just not to go without saying, or the Russo-Ukrainian context, you've got these divergent conflicts in many different ways, while at the same time they're you have opposing forces having to sort of conscript in new ways, or at least in our lifetimes, previously unprecedented ways in the spaces that they're working in. Active combatants. I think what I'm trying to dance around something, I'm not exactly sure, maybe I'll just kind of be pointed about it, but are there ways in which today, for both of you, actually, we see shifts in capitalist command that are more representative, or maybe there's more disintermediation through security concerns, whether those be domestic economy concerns, or, for example, in foreign military conflict. Also, in many places, domestic military conflict. So, are there ways that we're seeing today in the present shifts in capitalist command, capitalist statecraft that is navigated by security mobilization? That's like three or four questions combined, so forgive the stutter and stop there. And if the answer is no, that's also fine.
I feel like I'm still not totally sure what you're asking. Yeah, maybe Nate, do you have an answer at this point?
I mean, I think it's partly a matter of the degree of analytical abstraction, and those serve different purposes, all of which are valid. So, like, my stuff, a lot of my stuff is like, I mean, to put it reductively, a critic of my stuff could reasonably say, oh yeah, nothing's new under the sun. I made that joke about my book. Things were bad and then differently bad later, right? So my stuff emphasizes continuity, like that in all these shifts, the system changes to remain the same. And so we're going to see shifts that reposit longstanding problems. That's true and important for some purposes. It's also has limitations for other purposes, because concretely, the left and the workers' movement has to act. The left and the workers' movement doesn't act in a context of general tendencies. It acts in a concrete situation that confronts concrete expressions of those general tendencies. And so I think at that level there are tremendously important shifts. What the shifts are in terms of the organization of the state and military conflicts on, that feels kind of above my pay grade. I wish I had a better sense of that stuff. But I will also say, this past 8 months or so, the genocide in Gaza has been so horrific that it's been hard to. I was going to say stunned silence, but I'm pretty loud. I've been kind of like stunned. I've been whatever the loud version of stunned silence is. I've been like sort of screaming more than thinking, because the horror of it is. It sort of relates to what we're talking about ideology. The basic patterns of social life in capitalism are themselves disciplinary and promote the reproduction of the system. And that sort of being stunned by the horror is a facet of that. Like the awfulness disorganizes in an important respect. It doesn't absolutely do so, but it works in that direction. And the very important solidarity mobilizations, the very important mobilizations of Palestinian people that we've seen, they're working. They have to confront and overcome that sort of being stunned horror. So it's not. It is a political problem that can be overcome, but it is a real one. But yeah, in terms of what the concrete shifts are, that's. I don't know as much about that. I feel like that's got to be true, but I don't. But I don't think I don't feel confident to address what they are. The genocide in Gaza feels like a historical transformation in a very important way. But on the other hand, I think you probably make an argument that this just is the history of settler colonialism. This is the history of white supremacy. This is the history of imperialism, and it's always been this way. It's just an expression of that. And I think there's probably elements of truth to both of that. But, so yeah, I don't know how to answer that question in a way that feels satisfactory. I think it's a very thought-provoking question, though.
Okay, I'm gonna look at some. What do I have here? Oh yes. So I have a couple of maybe let's say like trans historical questions, or questions on the trans historicity of these topics that you all address in the book. To be honest, when I've been talking with people about these events coming up, sitting at the bar or work, or going back and forth with Red May people and other comrades and militants, it's odd how frequently in these interpersonal settings people really do sort of shift into a broad scale, deep historical focus. Trans historicity being a sort of approach or watchword that a lot of people on the left, especially Marxists, are a little nervous about, maybe unfortunately so. But typically I've pointed to the fact, trans-historical in a certain sense doesn't have to be beyond the scope or transcending history, but it could also just be shorthand for along stretches and varieties of different histories. And with the question of military and the question of social murder, this seems particularly apt. So most people are like, haven't these things always been around? What would this be to not have? What would a world look like to not have these things? So on the one hand, I'm curious how you all might approach questions of military, or what Engels calls force units, in the historical perspective, or sorry, in how do you respond to the trans-historical claim, the naturalization of force on the one hand, and then on the other, if there's a way in which we could say that maybe there is a trans-historical condition to some of these factors, but if it is, it's a history of wounds. Like if there's one shared common element that unfortunately a lot of us recognize. It's a history of wounds. And so I'm curious, just on the one hand, how you all might look at social murder, military security questions to somebody on the street, somebody you've just met who brings this up. And then on the other, maybe if you don't mind, I know it's a bit of a stretch for everybody, but maybe speculate a little bit on what some conditions would look like, or things that you would like to see towards processes of the historical foundations of socialism that might push or walk us in directions that would countermand, abolish, or sublate these conditions of legality and lethality that we are experiencing today. Does that make sense? Slightly more clear than the previous thing. Maybe, I don't know.
I would answer your first question about kind of, or at least part of my work is aiming to show like that, like how as Marxists we think of the state that we live in as a capitalist state. I think we should look at the military that of those states as capitalist military specifically. And I would kind of answer the questions rather than kind of rambling about various examples and like data points and stuff. I would recommend other books. So one is Justin Rosenberg's fantastic book, The Empire of Civil Society, a critique of the realist theory of international relations. Because I think as Marxists or people on the left, we're often like in international politics drawn to what we could broadly call realism, because it seems like that, you know, the liberal approaches tend to be so hypocritical that we're like, realists must have it. And I think Justin Rosenberg does a fantastic job of deconstructing the realist theory of international relations in his book. Another great one is a non-Marxist book by great military historian Beatrice Husser. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce her name, but her book from 2022 is called War, a Genealogy of Western Ideas and Practice. And it's a non-Marxist reading of it, but that kind of historicization of the process of how do we get to modern and contemporary forms of war, and actually talks about, there's a great chapter on the soldier. You know, how does this idea of this thing that's distinct from mercenaries, for example, develop? So I'd recommend that book if people are open to a non-Marxist reading. That's the thing with studying security and war. You have to read non-Marxists because otherwise you would read very little. But yeah, reading critically is important. So I'd recommend those, I think.
So I on the question of transhistorical, I think that there's two people use this term in a couple different ways, and I think it's good to specify. So I think correctly that Marx has some transhistorical conceptions. He says in the introduction to the Grundrisse very directly, there are some determinations of social production that are present in all eras of human history. And so there are some transhistorical elements to human sociality. And sociality itself is a transhistorical quality of, it's in the concept of human being. The thing is, for Marx, he thinks that that stuff is largely a backdrop and doesn't really do any explanatory work. So it's not that there's nothing transhistorical, it's that what's transhistorical explains very little. And so the objection to transhistoricality is not, oh, there's nothing transhistorical. The objection is that which is transhistorical sheds very little light. And I think that's a fairly important point, because there are people who, Marxists, who wrongly think that Marx doesn't have any transhistorical conceptions, or that there are no valid transhistorical conceptions. That's just an error on their part. But the thing is what's so, like all human societies seem to involve language and tool use. That's just straightforwardly true. And so what? That doesn't explain very much. So I think the point is that to really explain things, we have to be historically specific. Marx also says there are determinations that are true of multiple eras of multiple epochs of social production, of human history, but not all of them. I think that's also very important. And there's a great old labor song, "We Have Fed You All for 1,000 Years." It was published, I think, in 1905, 1908. So that says from 900 to, taken literally, from 900 to 1900, there's been an oppressed class who has fed them, fed a you. That's true, right? Marx and Engels say this. History is a history of class struggle, which implies history is a history of class societies. That doesn't mean that class is baked into human sociality as such. Not at all. Class is a historical phenomenon. It came into being at some point after the existence of human societies, and it will pass away when we finally get to a classless communist society. And so I think that that's also something, that when you're saying, well, hasn't this always existed? I would think no. But the truth of the people say, well, that's always existed. That's literally false. But what's useful, the rational kernel of that's true, is that elements of what Jasmine and I are talking about are baked into class societies as such. And capitalism is not the first class society. It's incumbent that we make it be the last class society. And if we don't, there will be forms of harm that share things in common. If humanity exits capitalism into a new form of class society, there will be some elements of harm in common with what Jasmine and I were talking about in that new society. But I think what we're both getting at, in part, is trying to say, let me back up one more time. Class is a relationship of subordination, and that's harmful. If you have class societies, people are suffering and probably dying from class relationships. But what we're both drawing out is that there are capitalism-specific forms of organizing class relationships and organizing those harms. And so that would be my response to that. People saying, well, hasn't this always existed? No, but it has existed a long time. And what people are pointing out is that, which I think is really important, is the thread that connects different forms of class societies and their generation of harm. And whether that's what matters, or whether what matters is the capitalism specific elements, or whether what matters is, trying to say in response to the previous question, or what matters is like the more granular concrete detail of, this military atrocity in Gaza today, or, silicosis in this industry today. Like, that depends on what the task is, right? All those claims are true. They're just claims that are made at different levels of analytical abstraction, and which level of analytical abstraction to use depends on the situation you're in and why you're using it. So that would be my response. And very quickly on the history of wounding, I think I really like that way of putting it. Class is a wounding relationship. The relation seems to be the case that class societies are societies with militaries. I don't know. I'm just spitballing there, but I would guess that you don't have, where you have one, you have the other. If you have a class society, you have something like a military. If you have a military, you have a class society. We may hunch. I'm not sure. But those are the categories of, that's all a history of wounding, and how that wounding is organized varies by time and place concretely. But there's also a history of solidarity and universality. There's a long history of movements. Like I said, I'm from the anti-globalization generation. There was a phrase that was taken up in that era, omnia sunt communia, everything for everyone, which was a sort of hearkening back to pre-capitalist communist peasant rebellions. That's a sort of saying, well, look, we can look back to this longer history of solidarity. And to my mind, you asked sort of the historical foundation of socialism. To my mind, that foundation resides almost entirely in the subject, like in the building of a conscious class subject. I don't think that there are objective openings to that, other than like the ruling class fucks up and creates an opportunity for the movement. I don't think that I don't think class domination moves and this is thing reasonable people can disagree on, though I think I'm right about this. I don't think systems of domination move of their own volition, of their own inherent tendencies toward non-domination. At most, they move toward variations on domination, and actual emancipation rests upon the construction of a large collectivity. I'm not a Leninist, but Lenin has a very apt quote on this. Politics begins when millions are in motion, not thousands, millions, right? So the historical foundation will be millions in motion imbued with it doesn't have to be Marxist, but it has to be able to do the things Marxism can do. Millions in motion with an analysis and with an ethic of solidarity, with an ethos of universality, and so on. And that has to be built. That would be my response to the historical foundations of socialism part.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing, I think the question of, it's just like, I mean, the kind of question of history and all this kind of stuff can seem a bit like academic, and there's nothing wrong with the academic. I mean, I find it fun, but I think the importance of this question is basically a question of can society be otherwise? Can the way we are be otherwise, right? And so by saying like things have always been this way, the implication of that is things cannot be different, right? And I think that's why that capitalism is a historical thing, means that it can be transcended, like that things can be otherwise. And that I just want to reiterate is that's the importance of this question when we get down to it, is like what the idea of like like, are you completely governed by something called human nature, or like that people are inherently bad or greedy or competitive or whatever? That's a theory of change, or a theory of not change inside itself. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate, like, why is this an interesting or important question? Yeah.
And I'm going to jump in again quickly. Also, Jasmine, your talk really laid this out very, very effectively in the emphasis on the reliance of the military and other facets of capitalism on cooperative labor. That cooperation has to be constructed. People have to be disciplined into it, and it can be withdrawn. And there's a tremendous amount of effort that goes into preventing that withdrawal, which also means a tremendous amount of effort in preventing or working against the organization of people to withdraw from that and to to posit our cooperative, the potential of our cooperative activity in a different direction. And so I think that also gets into the antagonism thing that that you talk more about. And I said this is a limitation of my stuff, is that this stuff is also contested all the time. And my chapter focuses on the ways in which to the degree my chapter gets involved, I focus on the ways in which the state misdirects those forms of contestation. And I'm right about that, but a limitation of my chapter and my stuff broadly is that I don't do enough to draw out that those limited forms of contestation still matter in lots of ways. They're not reducible to their limits. They can contribute to the building of a class subject in important ways. And they also demonstrate the at least at some level, at least notionally, the vulnerability of the system, so that it's not a permanent. Domination isn't permanent. It is historical. It arose in the past. It will pass away in the future. And that passing away will come through the withdrawal of our cooperative labor and the organization of new forms of cooperative labor. But I think the ongoing presence of forms of contestation are really important for as part of that foundation, for establishing it. And also that's what a larger movement for socialist revolution will in fact grow out of, or these local pockets of people positing alternative values, pursuing forms of democratization, and so on. Folks don't often know that that's what they're doing, and this is a point where, people do, not to say that the working classes, I don't agree with the classical, the working class is limited to trade union consciousness. I don't think that's true, but I do think that there has to be a surpassing of a consciousness of, we're just an interest group within a society that can't go away. There has to be a shift toward a consciousness of we want ours now in the short term in this society, but we want this society to pass away. But I do think that those small instances of antagonism that break out have the potential to help people move in that direction. I don't think it's automatic, though, and that's also a reason why efforts like Red May to say we need to put this analysis out very broadly, I think are so important.
So I got one last question for y'all. Really want to bring it back into the book. So again, with Red May, we're doing a series this July. This upcoming Friday, July 12th, we've got Alyssa Battistoni and Rob Hunter. On Wednesday, July 17th, we've got Raphael Kachachurian, Eva Nanopoulos, and Stephen Mayer coming in. I'm going to ask everybody this question, so if any of you all are watching coming up, get some answers ready. The book is called Marxism and the Capitalist State. I feel like we've tread and navigated that aspect a lot today in very clarifying ways, especially, and again, redeeming our boy Engels, extending the Marxism well beyond old Karl. The subtitle to the book, After the Colon, Towards a New Debate. So my question for you is kind of pretty simple. Like, what do you hope, each of you together, however you want to do it, what do you hope people take away from this book? And what do you see as the new debate? What are the grounds of the new debate that you're looking for? If that makes sense.
I'll jump in, Jasmine. You look like you're still mulling. So I think I mentioned it, or you mentioned it at the beginning. Tony Smith has written a really good review of the book, and his review draws out the areas of agreement among the chapters, and it also draws out some of the disagreements. So I would encourage folks to look at that. And one of the things that he underlines as an area of disagreement, there are others. So one area of disagreement is just people have different theoretical touchstones, different explanatory frameworks, and so on. But another one that he draws out is there is a question of what's the ceiling on reformist efforts and what's the value of reformist struggles. And so that's a good debate. And I think we could push that further and say, what's the relationship between the state and various kinds of struggles? And it seems to be the case that reformist struggles are, I don't know if they're inherent. I was going to say inherently, but I'm second guessing myself. Reformist struggles tend to be a relationship to the state in important ways, in the capitalist state, and the capitalist state tends to work to keep those struggles system compatible and to prevent things from getting out of hand. Like I said, my stuff isn't as good on this as I'd like it to be. I'm actually working on a response to the review, to Tony's remarks in the review, because it's stuff I've been meaning to think about for a while. So I've thought a lot about, but I haven't written it down. I think so. One of the things I would like people to grapple with those questions. I think they're really significant. And I think that the fact that the chapters do come from different backgrounds, theoretically have different objects of immediate analysis, do have some different politics. I think that's stuff that would be good for people to just argue through that. And then, there's some practical questions that get thrown up periodically by the movement. We saw the repressive apparatus of the state come in a big way a few years ago in response to the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd. We're seeing the repressive apparatus of the state massively deployed in genocide in Gaza. So there's sets of questions around that. It'd be really nice to see the class go on the march a little bit more and see, questions of strategy come to the fore. So, that's also, I think, an issue, like what the salience of the issue. The issues that should be debated partly arise from what the context is. And right now the context feels pretty bleak to me, though I work on pretty bleak stuff. So maybe that's, more me. But, as the class goes on the march a little bit more, the debate shifts in a different direction. But one other thought on this, there's there's a text from 1936 by Anton Pannekoek called Class and Party. Maybe it's Party and Class. I don't remember. But he has a bit where he says it's easy to think that we should all just agree with each other. And there's a classical notion of the party as a collection of people who all just agree. But the reality is politics is hard and the movement throws up hard questions, and our class opponents throw up hard questions about what to do. And the actual reality is that we're going to continue to have contention around this, and that calls to unity against contention. You need to have contention organized the right way, but it's just the historical process is one of disagreement over this stuff, and I think that's just accurate and true. And so I think the part of what should people get from the book? People should read the stuff and work through it, and then draw their own conclusions. In the contexts that they're in, ideally collectively discussing it with comrades and coworkers and so on. It feels like a not a very satisfactory answer. Have the debate, I guess, but that's my honest opinion. Is we've tried to roll the rock forward a little bit further, but there's a lot more rolling forward to do.
Yeah, I feel similarly. I think towards a new debate, I mean, there will be people who know the old debates, and there'll be people who are younger or newer to this stuff who don't. And I think, as we mentioned before, the introductory chapter is really fantastic, laying out kind of what's come before, why a debate at all, why a debate now, what are our resources for working through these things. So what I hope is that people engage in it, and if it's your first time engaging with these issues, it can be really overwhelming, but get into it, because it's, I think, intellectually rewarding, politically rewarding. And I would also hope that people get into it not in the sense that you need to figure out like what is the one true answer to everything, and who are the idiots amongst us. Like, I think we can go into it with a relatively non-sectarian kind of mindset. We'll all benefit, as much as that's possible. Because I think there are different things that I believe and think are true, and things I think are not true, and things that annoy me to no end. But I definitely don't think that I have answered like more than a small fraction of the questions that I want answered. So that's my investment in the debate is, as we said, the capitalist state is constantly changing. It's constantly adapting. There's plenty of new horrors greeting us every year, and every week, it seems. So, and the state is, as much as it pretends to not be a part of it, it is. And we need to understand them and debate them, and do self-criticism also. So I hope people go into it with an open-minded kind of view, not with a view to kind of find enemies or find a new kind of stake out a new identity kind of claim in like, I'm a this kind of Marxist, because that can be very annoying, and not helpful, I think. So yeah, I hope people read the book and enjoy it, and join the rest of the Red May discussions, because there's some really like stonking good people who will be talking, who have fantastic chapters, and I'm sure we'll have amazing things to say. So yeah, that's what I hope for the new debate.
The book is called Marxism and the Capitalist State Towards a New Debate. Again, this is part of a Red May series of 3 events that we're doing this July 2024. Today we've had Nate Holdren and Jasmine Chorley-Schulz. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you coming out and giving us an opportunity to learn from you and with you, and sharing this with one another. This is a part of Red May. We are a political education organizing group. If you like the stuff that you've seen here today, and you want to contribute, reach out to us, send us an email, just holler at us any way you can find us. Where you can find us on Instagram and Twitter and all that stuff. You can join in and help out. We have a volunteer sheet and are taking more and more people every day right now, which is very exciting, from all around North America. You can find that on our website. If you don't have the time or the inclination, but you're like, maybe I could help out in another way, you could also become a subscriber on our Patreon at patreon.com/RedMaySeattle. We are all like a volunteer force on our end, but on the one hand, it just contributes to us, to the costs of making this minor machine run, greasing the wheels, if you will. And the more we get, the more exciting projects that we can work on, and also hopefully start providing a little bit of extra cheddar, some scratch and cheddar to the participants. Put a little cheddar on the pasta, So anyway, feel free to check us out there, and you can also find us at youtube.com/RedMayTV to see some of our previous events, as well as all your favorite podcast streams. We turn everything into audio files, etc. We're also working on building out the entire repository of our materials into reader-friendly versions to contribute to an interesting response we're getting from people, which is the need for translations. So we are working on it, I swear. Anyway, I am Sean. We are Red May, and thank you for joining us so much. Enjoy your day.